Welcome back to Media7, where I'm talking to Roger Brooking and Simon Cunliffe about prisons and the press. The biggest story in our prison system this year is penal privatisation. Jose Barbosa looks at what's at stake.
Some see the prison system as a luxurious wonderland where inmates are fed truffles before being sent out the door after a few turns on the merry-go-round. To others, though, it's a soul-crushing bog of horror, which treats prisoners like pus expelled from an ingrown toenail. With all this going on, the question of how prisons should be run becomes very contentious, and that includes privatisation. New Zealand's experiment with privately run prisons began in 2000 with the Auckland Central Remand Prison. It returned to state administration 5 years later, but a change in government saw the wheel turn again in 2009.
John Key's convinced private competition could improve our struggling prison system.
They were an effective operator from a cost perspective. So, in my view, competition's a healthy thing.
The Auckland Remand and Mount Eden prisons were combined, and the contract to run it awarded to a multinational called Serco. Serco is an outsourcing nymphomaniac. Its fingers are everywhere. Serco looks after Britain's ballistic missile defence system and its nuclear arsenal, handles driver licence testing in Canada, runs prisons in Britain, Germany and Australia, and it even sets Greenwich Mean Time. Their secret to success? According to this in-house video, heaps of awesome PowerPoint meetings.
Serco's human capital management services blend high-tech with high-touch.
They also have a 25-year contract to build and operate a new men's prison at Wiri in South Auckland. The argument is that privately run prisons are cheaper on the state.
I see no particular reason why a private sector company couldn't run one. Auckland Remand Prison was a great example of a success story previously in New Zealand run by the private sector.
But that doesn't stack up.
When the Auckland Central Remand Prison here in the city was run privately by Australians for 5 years, it cost $43,000 per inmate. That's $7,000 more than when it was run publicly.
Opponents argue that privately run prisons are only required to maintain their profit. Nothing makes this more clear than this investor presentation for the Corrections Corporation of America. In what is possibly the bleakest PowerPoint ever made, the failing economy and depressing crime statistics are described as highly compelling industry dynamics. They'd love New Zealand. Since 1992, the incarceration rate has increased by 62%. In other words, the more the world goes to hell, the better the share price.
Well, Simon Cunliffe, the government was elected with a private prisons policy, so it has a mandate. Have we had the discussion, though?
Listen, I don't think we really have had the discussion. I mean, private prisons really took off in the States, and we really need to look at the reality on the ground in the United States. There are now, according to an article in the New Yorker, recent article in the New Yorker, about 6 million people under correctional supervision in the United States. That's more than were ever under the same sort of supervision under Stalin. And so that's a really sobering statistic. Same article makes some very good points about the pressures that a corporate addition to the mix of crime and punishment adds, and that is the pressure to fill those prisons, you know, build them and we will fill them, sort of thing. There's in particular...
Yeah, the last thing that those companies want is a drop in the crime rate, isn't it?
Absolutely, you know, there are annual reports from, for instance, the Corrections Corporation of America that openly talks about warns investors of the dangers of a move towards more lenient sentencing and what have you on the share price. So we need to be aware that this is an additional factor that can play a part in our corrections philosophy.
See, I see the privatisation of prisons actually as a red herring, because there's another discussion that should happen before that, and that discussion is, do we actually need another prison? And the answer to that is quite clearly that we don't. currently across the New Zealand corrections system, there are nearly 1,600 empty beds. The new prison at Wiri is going to add another 960 beds. Sure, Mount Crawford, New Plymouth is going to be shut down. That's about 200 beds, and a few other units will be shut down. But overall, we already have excess capacity in our prison system. There is absolutely no reason, in my opinion, why we should build another one.
And yet, it has to be said, these new prisons are nicer places. The Auckland Remand Prison is better than what it replaced at Mount Eden.
They look nicer from the outside, I grant you that. But prison is not a nice place to be, whether it's old or new. One of the justifications that the Corrections Department has put forward for building new prisons is that it's easier to produce or to do rehabilitation. That's just nonsense. None of the programs run by the Corrections Department, whether they're in old prisons or new prisons, really have made any difference whatsoever to New Zealand's rate of recidivism. Over the last few years, recidivism has gone up, not down.
But I'm also interested, Simon, in the fact that there are a number of studies in New Zealand that show that the public perception of things like sentence severity is completely at odds with the reality.
Well, that may play a part, and you know, that's something that we need to look at and we need to have a discussion about. But that's a discussion that really needs to be led at a high level, and there needs to be political consensus on it, and there needs to be political leadership in the first instance.
I wonder, Roger, whether you've got some awareness of what kind of story sells as well, because although there are clear humanitarian issues in our prisons, you have focused more on the fiscal imperative. Is that because you think we're too brutal as a nation to care?
Yes, it is in a way. I mean, I go into prisons regularly and I hear just appalling stories, and I struggle to put those stories into the media because it seems to me that the media isn't interested. And in terms of whether or not New Zealand is ever going to take a different direction on this subject, it seems to me that the economic argument is more winnable, more understandable, and more persuadable to the public and to New Zealand politicians than some incredibly appalling story about abuse meted out to some prisoner.
Do you have such stories? Is there a story of prisoner abuse that you think should have been headline news?
Well, yes, there is. There's one particular story that I heard from two different prisoners told me the story about a guy who wanted to commit suicide. He drank some kind of, I don't know what it was, cleaning fluid or something. He ended up in agony, rolling around on the floor of his cell. Every prison cell has an emergency button. He pressed the button. A prison officer came to see what was happening, just walked past, said, "Toughen up, mate." Half an hour later, the guy was feeling even worse, pressed the button again. The guard comes past again, same thing happened. Eventually, they realised this guy was about to die, so they called an ambulance, and he died, as far as I know, on the way to the hospital in the ambulance. Maybe everybody doesn't know, but 50% of prisoners have been diagnosed with mental illness. 60% supposedly have personality disorders. About 2/3 have had a significant brain injury, and potentially 90% of them have had problems with alcohol and drugs. So the chances that this individual suffered from depression or some other mental illness is highly likely.
And yet through public health campaigns, including quite prominent ones, John Kirwan and all that, we have become apparently more understanding as a nation of things like mental illness. Why do we not apply that here as a nation? Because we don't, do we?
Well, I think there's some understanding of mental illness and the need for good treatment in the community, but in the prison, that just doesn't happen. The United Nations minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners requires every prison to have a medical officer who has some training in psychiatry. Well, that is ignored. Anne Tolley has just introduced the Corrections Amendment Bill, which is going to remove the responsibility for medical care and health care of prisoners away from these doctors and place it in the hands of nurses.
And what's the difference there?
The nurses are employees of the Corrections Department, so they can be told by a prison manager what kind of medical care to deliver to a certain prisoner, whereas a doctor who has taken those medical oaths has to make decisions based on healthcare and best practice principles. this is an appalling step, in my opinion.
Were you aware of that, Simon? Because I wasn't until Roger told me before the show.
No, absolutely not. And Roger and I obviously need to speak to each other a bit more frequently. To be fair to the media, you know, mistreatment of prisoners, deaths in prison, what have you, they do get pretty high-profile sort of coverage. That is news. We put the operations of the Corrections Department fairly regularly under fairly hefty scrutiny, so it's not just sensationalising crime for the sake of it. But yes, a very interesting factor that I certainly wasn't aware of it. Possibly slightly handicapped by the fact that we don't have an on-site parliamentary reporter covering those sorts of bases, but yeah.
Well, like I said, I didn't know either, and if we've got the dialogue going between you two, then I think we've achieved something tonight. So thank you, Roger Brooking and Simon Cunliffe, and thanks to you for watching. We'll be back with Media 7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.